So now we've been talking about evolution, we've been talking about populations evolving, and we've been using the term species a whole lot. And so what we need to do is take a little bit of time and discuss what a species really is, and then also think about how species are related to each other, because ultimately that's what evolution's all about. So the definition for species will vary, but the one that we're going to use is basically a group whose members have the ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Sometimes you'll throw in there who they possess similar anatomical characteristics. But as we go on, we'll talk about sexual dimorphism, which can be extreme in some cases where males and females are very, very different. You might not think they're the same species at all. But the fact that they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, that's going to be really our definition. So we have many, many different species, many different types of life, but we have a common ancestry, right? So basically, if two populations of the same species encounter different selective pressures and they don't get to interbreed, they will evolve differently, right? Because we're selecting for genes that provide them with reproductive abilities, advantage in the environment. And if the environments are different, those genes that are going to be selected for are different. If they keep selecting for different genes, ultimately they become so genetically different that they won't be able to interbreed. Right? So if enough change occurs, eventually genotypes between these populations are so different they can't produce viable offspring. So this is what we call a phylogenetic tree. This is a very basic phylogenetic tree, but it just shows you some common ancestor then was the progenitor for lizards and snakes and crocodiles and birds. Like all of these share a common ancestor. They all evolved from some common ancestor. And these trees can be quite elaborate. This one is just a sketch then of like the ultimate tree from the beginning of life down with prokaryotes to eukaryotes to multicellular organisms to all the extant, as opposed to extinct, all the living species at the tips of those branches. Now, the idea when you look at phylogenetic trees, it's a way to diagram the evolutionary relationships among a group of organisms. You also have to think about the word that's called a clade. So clade, C-L-A-D-E, is all of those individuals that are related to a common ancestor. So if you look at this one, you can go back to Lulu, this supposed ancestor at this point in this phylogenetic tree, look at all of her descendants, and that would constitute a single clade. Now, if you really think about this, this is a relative term because the further you go back, Lulu is in the clade for organism A, right? And so we're oftentimes going to have to narrow our focus down when we look at a particular group, because otherwise you ultimately keep going back to the argument, which is valid, that, well, everything is related to everything else, and that is absolutely true. So if we look at these phylogenetic trees, we're going to learn how to read them better through practice, but basically they're usually oriented either vertically or horizontally, and you move, from this case, from the bottom to the top through time. So the bottom of the tree would be the root, right? And so these are the similar terms that we're going to use when we talk about plant biology. So there's the root, and every time it branches, it's called a node. And then the branches end in tips, and the tips are where we list different, in this case, living species. So what it's saying is that there was some common ancestor for all carnivores, right, in the order of carnivora, and we'll talk about a taxonomy a little bit later. There was some common ancestor to cats and skunks and otters and wolves and dogs, right? But as you go and move down the tree, you can see that skunks and otters have a more recent branching point to each other than they do with wolves and dogs. And so they're more closely related to each other than they are to wolves and dogs. And then though all four of those are related to cats, cats diverged from the line most distantly in the past. So they're the most distant ancestor when you look at the group of 5 organisms here. Now, sometimes these trees are drawn to scale and sometimes they're not, right? If they are drawn to scale, then literally how far apart the branching points are can tell you accurately how distantly or closely related an individual is. And so sometimes they're drawn roughly, sometimes they're not drawn at all, and that's something that someone has to tell you. You wouldn't be able to tell that just from looking at a tree. Okay. Now, how you organize these then becomes a topic of great debate. And so when we talk about evolution in our next recording, about how we study evolution, that's how do we gather data to say, oh, kangaroos and North American beavers are more closely related to each other than they are to the duck-billed platypus. And so one way to do that is look at their characteristics, right? Some central core characteristics of the organism. Does it have a backbone? All these things have backbones. And so one could suggest that all things with backbones are more closely related to each other than they are to things without backbones, right? And then hair and mammary glands. Now you're talking about mammals. Gestation, long gestation, and so on and so forth. But again, this is more debatable than you might think upon first look. But we'll talk about that more later. So that being said, when you look at primates, people like to argue that we did not evolve from monkeys, and they are absolutely correct. We did not evolve from monkeys, right? And no one who studies evolution ever said that we did. You need to understand evolution to say that we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. And they're our most closely related species to humans, Homo sapiens. So we have, of all the species that are out there, we share a common ancestor most recently with chimpanzees. From the point that we branched out from there, we've only been other species of Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, what have you. And you can take a whole course, physical anthropology, and study the human evolution. So that's an important point that I want everyone to know. Now, when we talk about species, where and how what things promote these branching points, right? So we definitely said environment, but we can break that down then into a couple of what we call prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. So prezygotic and postzygotic. So automatically that should say to you, oh, zygote. What's a zygote? A zygote is the result of the union of egg and sperm, of syngamy between these gametes, right? So if this sounds unfamiliar to you, you need to go back and review your vocabulary. So prezygotic means what kind of barriers are seen in a population or an environment that prevent the zygote from forming and hence lead to speciation events. What are those that are postzygotic, that happen after the zygote forms, that lead to speciation events? So I've got a couple examples here. And so prezygotic barriers, we can break it down into, number one is habitat isolation. If you've got two species that just don't encounter each other, and we're calling them species now because they come from an original population, and some mutation results in some subset of the population to spend more time, in this case in the water, than on the land. And so if this continues and that they start to rarely encounter each other because they're in occupying different habitats, then ultimately they will begin to evolve differently, right? So it's not that they couldn't interact and mate and make babies, but they just don't run into each other enough, so that's habitat isolation. And eventually they will change so much that they can't make babies. Now you've got different species. You can't form babies. They're prezygotic, all right? So they never get a chance to mix sperm and egg. Now, temporal isolation is our second type of prezygotic barrier. Okay, so temporal isolation means that you've got species that breed at different times. So this could be two closely related now species because one was diurnal and one was nocturnal. One was awake during the day and one was awake only at night. Okay, or they come into heat or the ability to breed at different times of year. Right? So the seasons when they breed are different, and so they just never get a chance to mix sperm and egg, prezygotic barrier, but it's based on time. So temporal isolation, habitat isolation. Now, behavioral isolation is the isolation I call you're not sexy, right? So this now goes back to the idea that we have many behaviors that are genetically programmed. And this is very apparent in the animal kingdom, where, for example, the picture here these are birds called blue-footed boobies. And the blue-footed booby does a very particular dance before mating to attract mates. If you don't dance well, you don't get to mate, right? And so if you have a mutation that causes your behavior to change, if that's no longer attractive, guess what? You don't get to pass on your genes, right? And now it's become isolated to only those that find that particular behavior attractive. And so that may then cause a splintering of two groups, ones that have mutated in a way that new behavior is pre-mating ritual, and the old behavior is pre-mating ritual for another group, and so they don't get to mix their genes. Behavioral isolation. All right. So those first three, habitat, temporal, behavioral, you should know. Then we have mechanical isolation, where literally you may have mutations that arise in a population where you can't deliver sperm and egg, right? So here you see two snails. There's left-handed, right-handed snails. If they can't basically get their parts together. You also see this in many insects where the copulation doesn't occur because it's like a lock and key, right? So sperm can't be delivered to egg. It doesn't work. It's mechanical isolation. And then finally, here's for your notes, just these definitions. The finally then is gametic isolation. So the sperm of one species may not be able to fertilize the eggs of another species, right? And so again, species here is kind of used in a future tense in that you may have two groups of what was considered one population or were split for some reason, evolved slightly differently, and now they may be able to mate, to copulate. Sperm can be delivered to egg, but the sperm will never fuse with the egg. Because this is stuff that you'll learn as you go on and talk about physiology, but literally there are proteins on the head of the sperm and on the coat the egg that have to interact like a lock and key, right? So only when those two proteins recognize each other is the sperm allowed to enter the egg for syngamy to occur, for the combination of genetic material to happen. And if a mutation occurs in those proteins, boom, you're locked out. So you may get sperm and egg together, but you'll never form a zygote, prezygotic barrier, gametic isolation, right? So all of those are preventing gamete from forming, and that can lead to new species arising. Now, postzygotic barriers occur when you get sperm and egg together and you produce offspring, but something's not quite right about that offspring. Right, so we break that into three groups, and those groups are reduced hybrid vitality. Basically, you have fragile children because you're genetically different enough that the baby is viable, but it's not very healthy, and they tend to die before reproducing. All right, you have reduced hybrid fertility. So this is you can produce fine, healthy offspring, but they're sterile. So this is the classic case of a donkey and a horse making a mule. Mules apparently are very robust, very sure-footed, but they're sterile. So every time you make a mule, you have to specifically mate a donkey and a horse. So reduced hybrid fertility. And then finally, what we see most often in plants is what's called hybrid breakdown. We try to mate two different species of plants, and you may get a robust first generation, but successive generations, as you continue to breed that plant either with itself, it will break down and ultimately become either infertile or reduced viability. All right. So these are the things that ultimately are resulting from genetic changes, and then as those genetic changes accumulate, what really promotes them? These idea of prezygotic and postzygotic barriers.